Good day. The last couple of hours in the fighting in Ukraine have witnessed another major Russian missile strike across Ukraine. Again, Ukraine claims to have shot down most or all of the Russian missiles that were launched. I'm going to come to a discussion of that shortly. And as well as this missile strike, there's been some activity on the battlefronts, and as I discussed yesterday, most of it seems to be consistent with the Russian forces continuing to make advances. So there was reports that the Russians have made some progress, some further progress in the north, in the sort of Siversk area, the northern parts of the fighting area, the northern Lugansk, southern Kharkiv region, the area around Svatovo, Kremenaya, Kupiansk. This complex part of the battlefield where we now know that General Lapin appears to be the overall commander, an individual who I've discussed at length in previous programs. He's not been without controversy. As I said, he's been criticized in the past by Ramzan Kadyrov, apparently on a misunderstanding of his exact role. But anyway, clearly the Russian military leadership continues to have confidence in General Lapin because he's clearly very much in charge in this northern part of the battlefronts. Perhaps more interesting still is continued Russian activity near the towns, the two central Donbass towns of Bakhmut, Artyomovsk, as I shall now increasingly call it, and Avdiivka. Now, there is now confirmation that the Russians are gradually increasing their attacks on Ivanivska and are making advances in the areas west of Artyomovsk, even as the Wagner forces have started to pull back from Artyomovsk, which is now securely under Russian control. Now, there's been no Russian breakthrough yet, and with the Russian forces undertaking a rotation, it's premature to expect one. But clearly, the Russians, for the moment at least, do seem to be considering at least some kind of advance, perhaps to take in Chasov Yar once Ivanivska is captured, and then, who knows, maybe to roll on further west still towards Konstantinovka. There have been succession of big Russian rocket and artillery strikes on Konstantinovka, and it could very well be that that is, or continues to be, a Russian objective. And then, perhaps the most interesting and tantalizing piece of information of all, a dam which seems to have also doubled as a bridge along one of the major roads leading to Avdiivka, this town to the west of Donetsk city, which has been held by Ukraine since the fighting in 2014, and which has been the major base of Ukrainian forces positioned near Donetsk city. Anyway, this dam and the bridge which went over it appears to have been destroyed. It's at a place called Karlova, and apparently the destruction of the bridge and the flooding caused by the dam is going to interfere, at least in some form, with Ukrainian communications, the ability of Ukraine to keep its forces in Avdiivka supplied and reinforced. Now, the Russians so far, at least as of the time of the making of this video, have not claimed credit for the destruction of this dam, and there's some suggestions that the Ukrainians might have been responsible. I can't conceive of why they would have done a thing like that. But anyway, regardless, I am fairly confident that it was indeed the Russians who launched this attack on this dam, and the fact that they took that step, that they've, in other words, severed a communications line between Avdiivka and the remaining Ukrainian forces further west, that suggests that the Russian offensive towards Avdiivka will continue. Now, it's a slow, incremental affair. As I said, Avdiivka, if you actually look into the map, it's now very obviously in a semicircle. The Russians are closing in around it. It's not going to happen fast. In this war, nothing does. But at least not for the moment, at least not when the Russians advance. But slow but steady pressure on Avdiivka is increasing, and Ukrainian losses in Avdiivka before long will no doubt also start to increase as well. Now, as I discussed in my last program, there's been some skepticism about the figures that Prigozhin has given for the losses. Both the Wagner organization and the Ukrainian army, according to Prigozhin, have suffered in the fight for Bakhmut. And I'm going to say straight away that I have had some doubts about these figures that Prigozhin gave myself. I think that the 5,000 men killed on the part of the Wagner organization, that looks to me to be roughly correct. I understand that MediaZone, which works with the BBC to try to track and identify Russian losses in the war, has only been able to identify 1,700 killed Wagner fighters. But I think that in trying to track the deaths of Wagner fighters, that might be rather more difficult than tracking the deaths of regular Russian military. And besides, I get the impression that the BBC and MediaZone only started to take seriously the question of researching and identifying dead Wagner fighters relatively late in their joint project, in other words, a few months ago. Now, I might be wrong about that, and if so, I apologize. But anyway, I still think on balance that perhaps 4,500, which is a figure that I was given by a source, somebody who has contacts that give him reliable information about the Wagner organization, 4,500 by February, apparently. The remaining fighting could have killed a further 500, perhaps. That seems not implausible to me. So the figure that Prigozhin is giving of 5,000 Wagner fighters killed, I'm going to go with. I'm not saying it's definitely correct. I can't corroborate it. I can't refute it, but it's plausible. But the more I've been thinking about his other figures, the more skeptical I am. The 10,000 convicts, which seems to me to be suspiciously close to the number given by John Kirby a few weeks ago, about a week ago, and he's claimed that 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers were also killed in the fighting in Bakhmut. I don't say that these figures are necessarily wrong. It's just that we can't know. We can't confirm them, and we shouldn't pretend that we can. And for the record, I think that Prigozhin's numbers might be, in terms of Ukrainian losses, roughly correct, or in the correct ballpark of the total number, but it could be rather less, or perhaps conceivably it might be rather more. What one can say is that it was an awful lot. Now, it's been pointed out to me that Prigozhin himself probably does have an accurate number of at least identified Ukrainians who've been killed, because apparently he's very careful in identifying the bodies of Ukrainian soldiers that have been killed and found in the fighting in Bakhmut and previously in Soledar. But one must assume that Ukraine was evacuating a lot of wounded soldiers and that some of them will have died. And one must also assume that some bodies would have been evacuated from Soledar and Bakhmut and those sort of places by the Ukrainians themselves. So I can't quite believe that Prigozhin does actually have a precise number. But anyway, he's given us some figures, but he's also said some other things. And this is all given over the course of a long interview. He made his usual abusive criticisms about the Russian Defense Ministry, about Shoigu and Gerasimov, about the Russian political elite altogether. He said that the war had backfired because Ukraine has become militarily far more powerful than it was at the outset, which all the other figures I have seen, they categorically contradict that claim. And he also spoke, of course, of the possibility of Russia being on the brink of a revolution against this corrupt elite, which he implies is failing to win or might possibly even lose this war. Now, I don't take any of this seriously. I've stopped taking much of what Prigozhin takes seriously. But I have to make the point that once again, Prigozhin, by making these statements, has given ammunition to Russia's critics and Ukraine's supporters in the West. I've read at least 5 articles over the last 24 hours in the Western media, including most especially the British media, but also in other places, all of which cite Prigozhin's claims and talk about the next Russian revolution being on the way. And I can't help but think that in Moscow, this kind of wild talk, which Prigozhin engages in, pursuing whatever agenda he has, whether it's an emotional one or a political one, I have no idea. But there must be a widespread feeling in Moscow that this is doing a lot of damage. It's making people in the West conclude that the war is going better for Ukraine than it is, but perhaps more seriously, it must be making a lot of people in Moscow fear that people in the West might get the idea that Russia is indeed on the brink of collapse. Now, I discussed these very extensive meetings that Putin had a couple of days ago with the members of his economic team. I said that it was interesting how he'd used a whole discussion of the North Sea route, the sea route along Russia's Arctic coast, that he'd developed that into a larger discussion about the state of the Russian economy. I noticed that he had reports from his Prime Minister, Mishustin, from Golikova, his Social Affairs Minister, Siluanov, the Finance Minister, was talking. Denis Manturov was talking as well. And thinking about this, I wonder whether this rather strange impromptu meeting, which was in part which had been convened to discuss the Northern Sea route, but then which veered strangely into a discussion about the general state of the Russian economy, with Golikova confirming that real incomes in Russia are rising, with Manturov talking about a mixed picture in industrial terms, but overall increases in industrial growth, with Dmitry Patrushev, the agriculture minister, talking about increases in food production. Whether all of went with Siluanov and Mishustin confirming that inflation has fallen to 2.3%, might decline further still, and that the situation in the budget is all under control. I do wonder now, thinking about Prigozhin's comments, whether Putin staged all of this in a kind of response to Prigozhin, basically reassuring people, telling them, look, we're not on the brink of any sort of revolution. On the contrary, things are actually going well for us. We're going well on the battlefield. We've just taken Bakhmut. We're advancing in Avdiivka. We're ready for this offensive that Ukraine might launch. And in terms of the economy, well, we can't say that all is well. We still have problems to overcome, left over from last year with the sanctions pressure. But generally speaking, things are getting better. The outlook is good. Inflation has fallen. Prices are down. Incomes are up. There's no need for a revolution, and nobody seriously expects one. And I wonder whether this is the case. Can I just say that I once more believe that Prigozhin, in making these comments, is not helping Russia. He might or might not be helping himself, but I don't think we should pay too much attention to these commentaries. And I think that the West, focusing on them, trying to use Prigozhin's statements, I can understand why it is done, but it runs the risk, the very real risk, of reinforcing certain Western misperceptions, which will probably lead ultimately to worst outcomes. It will make people, political leaders in the West, believe that the situation in Russia is more brittle and less stable than it really is. Anyway, I'm going to discuss this a little further in this program, but let me come back to Avdiivka. It's clear, whatever reading you make of Prigozhin's figures, even if you exercise a little skepticism about them, or perhaps a healthy dose of skepticism about them, as I do, then even if you do that, it's clear that Ukraine suffered a significant military defeat in Bakhmut and lost a lot of men and soldiers and machines. And yes, they are not the 30,000 or so troops that the West has trained for the offensive that we've been hearing so much about, which is going to be launched someday, who knows when, towards Zaporozhye region, nor did it involve the equipment that the West has supplied to Ukraine. There were all those rumours that Leopard 2 tanks had been seen in the vicinity of Chasov Yar and Bakhmut, but looks increasingly as if that was all wrong. Anyway, it doesn't involve all that equipment, all of those men, but it did nonetheless destroy some of Ukraine's best military formations, or at least degrade them severely. And that is, in my opinion, a major defeat and a major problem for Ukraine because, well, we'll talk about the offensive soon, but in the meantime, overall, the Ukrainian army, as a result of the Battle of Bakhmut, became absorbed in defending an undefendable place. It didn't conduct any kind of further offensive operations over the course of the winter. It suffered huge losses, and it's been left weaker than it was before. And I wonder whether the same pattern isn't going to repeat itself in Avdiivka, that the Ukrainians might decide that Avdiivka is symbolically hugely important. It's also tactically significant as well. It lies on the way to the important town of Pakrovsk, which is the center of the major Ukrainian held city in this part of Donbass. It's a major urban and logistical center, so that the Ukrainians might again decide to make the same mistake in Avdiivka that they made in Bakhmut, which is to try to cling on for as long as they can, accept enormous losses, accept the huge risks that go with that, because psychologically it is impossible for them to retreat. And the Russians have shown that they are able to turn this Ukrainian propensity to their advantage. They did that in Bakhmut. They might very well decide to do it in Avdiivka as well. And after all, they're waging a war of attrition, and it would be consistent with that kind of approach. Now, that might explain the mysterious disappearance of Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief, General Zaluzhny. Now, yesterday, I spoke about the rumors that the Russians were circulating that General Zaluzhny had been caught in shelling in Kherson region, that he'd received severe wounds to his skull, that he'd had to go through surgery in Kiev, that though he was expected to survive, he would no longer be able to command the Ukrainian forces anymore. I said that I was uncertain about the truth of these rumors. I also said that I did wonder whether partly the intention of spreading these rumors, which the Russians were engaging in, was to smoke Zaluzhny out, to, in effect, oblige the Ukrainians to produce him. And sure enough, they did produce him. And I'm sure it was done. In fact, it was definitely done in response to these rumors. And I think that was the Russian intention all along. But what was very interesting, and perhaps it's what the Russians also are aware of, is the way, were anticipating, was the way the Ukrainians produced Zaluzhny, which actually begs more questions. Now, General Zaluzhny has been a very visible commander. He regularly gives interviews, he's regularly seen, he visits the battlefronts on a regular basis. He is, shall we say, a public and publicly visible man. And yet he's been basically out of the scene since early May. There was a brief video, which just a few seconds long, in which he seemed to be addressing a conference in Odessa. And the video that was produced of him yesterday was very strange. Now, I should say firstly that I've seen the video, and I don't see any sign that General Zaluzhny has suffered any kind of injuries to his head, or that he has suffered, or that he has experienced surgery. He doesn't look to me at all as if he's been seriously wounded, at least not in over any recent period. Now, I know that videos and things like this can be faked. I'm not an expert in deciphering film. I have vision issues which would make that very difficult. But for the record, I thought this was a genuine film of Zelensky, and as I said, he seemed in reasonable health and condition, not visibly wounded, not visibly indisposed. In other words, himself. Moreover, there was someone with him, and that person shared a frame with Zelensky, so I didn't get the sense that these two people were being just juxtaposed in any way. And this person did give a date, which was the 25th of May. And I think, anyway, in summary, I think this is a real interview, a real meeting between Zelensky and this person. So, what is strange about this video then? Well, firstly, it was very brief, and secondly, the setting seems very strange. It was Zelensky in a room with this man. He appears to be sitting at a desk of some sort. It's not clear what he's doing, and he doesn't say very much. Now, it could be that Zelensky has simply been ill, and I think that is a very plausible possibility. But if he's been indisposed, if he's had flu or something more serious, why, but obviously not life-threatening, why hasn't Ukraine simply said that? Why this pretense that he's been well and active all along, if he's just been slightly indisposed? I mean, everybody falls ill from time to time. That doesn't make any kind of sense to me. And I have to say also that Zelensky seemed remarkably quiet and subdued throughout the whole video. I mean, he wasn't engaging very much. Anyway, in summary, to me, this whole video begged more questions than it answered. Now, it could be that Zelensky has, in effect, decided to work to rule, that he's, in effect, dissociated himself from the political leadership. It could be that there's some kind of political upheaval in the works in Kiev, and a lot of the recent actions of other people might be consistent with that. We see President Zelensky rather often on his travels. In a recent broadcast to the Ukrainian people, he made it fairly clear that he expects to be on his travels again very soon. We see Kirill Budanov, the intelligence chief. He seems to be making himself extraordinarily visible now, giving incredible interviews in which he talks about assassinations and murders and attacks on infrastructure, and uses awful, terrible language, and openly brags about all kinds of terrible things that his organization has been involved in. It seems to me that he's both a frankly sinister individual and at the same time somebody who is clearly now in the ascendant and who's going out of his way to make himself as visible as possible. Now, could it be that one of the reasons he's doing that is because either he's making some kind of bid for a higher position, or alternatively, because he feels himself to be under pressure, and by making these public comments in the way that he is, he's in effect implicating the rest of the Ukrainian leadership in his various activities. He speaks as if he talks for all of them and knows that they won't come out and speak out against him. And that might imply that Budanov himself feels that his own position, for some reason, is insecure. Well, perhaps this is all playing together, and perhaps Zelensky's disappearance is connected with Zelensky's travels and Budanov's increasingly alarming and concerning behavior. Or could it just be that Zelensky is in fundamental disagreement with this policy of defending ground, clinging on to positions, fighting for every inch of ground in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Mariupol, now in Bakhmut, previously in Solidar, soon in Avdiivka, that he thinks that this whole strategy is wrong. After all, just a few weeks ago, I remember reports in the US media in which the US apparently was advising Ukraine to abandon these policies of defending every inch of ground, to go over to mobile defense. Not clear to me how Ukraine can do that, but still. And one wonders whether, in talking to Ukraine in that way, the Americans might be echoing criticisms that Zelensky himself is making behind the scenes. Maybe Zelensky has absented himself from events because he wants to wash his hands clean of the Bakhmut debacle, make it very clear that this was something that he did not want to see happen, and presumably, if events repeat themselves in Avdiivka, he will feel the same way about that, and conceivably he could become detached from the Ukrainian war effort even more. Anyway, I don't know what the answers to all of these things are, but certainly I thought this video of Zelensky extremely strange, and as I said, for me it begs many questions. So we have that. We have the mystery of Zelensky. We have a deteriorating situation in Avdiivka. We have missile attacks right across Ukraine. And we have commentaries now starting to appear in the Western media about Russian hypersonic systems, and not just Russian hypersonic systems, but about hypersonic weapons in general. There was an interesting article in the Daily Telegraph which took the threat of these hypersonic weapons extremely seriously and discussed them with some intelligence, actually. Talked about how the West is worried about these weapons. But we've also had all kinds of other articles which are now increasingly accepting Ukraine's claims that they shot down a total of 7 Kinzhals, one by itself about 10 days ago, the second during the Russian attack on the Patriot system in Kiev, that they're taking all of these claims seriously. Now, let me say a few things. The first is that the Russians have completely disputed these claims. They say that Ukraine didn't shoot down any Kinzhals, that they're not capable of shooting down Kinzhals, that the Patriot missile system that Ukraine has been provided with is incapable of shooting down Kinzhal missiles. The Russians continue to insist that they inflicted severe damage on the Patriot missile system, that 5 launchers and a radar have been put out of action. That's what the Russians say. And interestingly enough, every so often, if you drill through these articles, you'll see that there is brief reference to these Russian denials. But the predominance of Western reporting of this incident takes the Ukrainian claims to have shot those Kinzhals down as true. And I've noticed some really concerning, at least to me, articles appearing now, talking about how this incident in Kiev proves how existing air defense systems can successfully defend targets from attack by hypersonic missiles such as the Kinzhal. Now, I think this is wildly dangerous, and to my mind, it shows how easily, dangerously corrupted debate in the West has become because of this over-free acceptance of Ukrainian claims. Now, Ukraine has made many claims at various times about the progress in the war, and they have turned out to be untrue. Let us take the Kinjal issue. To start with, when Ukraine first claimed that it shot down a Kinjal missile, a solitary Kinjal missile, the Ukraine's own air defense leadership came out and said publicly and repeatedly that the claim was untrue, that they had not shot down any Kinjal missile. They even contacted media outlets in Ukraine to tell them that this was a false story. Apparently, military officers who had spread that story were themselves called in and told that the story was untrue and asked to change that story. And yet, the political leadership in Ukraine persisted with it. They continued to insist, disregarding what their own air defense people were saying, that a Kinjal had indeed been shot down. And we went through the frankly grotesque spectacle of the mayor of Kiev showing off to journalists what he said was debris from a Kinjal missile, except that it wasn't a Kinjal missile. And then, of course, what happened is that clearly the military people, the air defense people, were brought into line because, having repeatedly denied that they'd shot down a Kinjal, they started to talk as if they had in fact done so. And then when the report came through that 6 more Kinjals had been shot down, the air defense people followed the line that had been set by the defense ministry itself, by presumably Defense Minister Reznikov's office, that indeed 6 Kinjal missiles had been shot down. Even though film that showed this whole incident frankly strongly argued against all of that. And I would suggest that the fact that the Ukraine's own air defense people have denied in the past that Ukraine has shot down Kinjal missiles ought in itself to make people who accept the story, the claim, that Ukraine has now shot down a further 6 Kinjal missiles, it ought to make them a lot more careful. But there's been other things too. I mean, Ukraine has not provided any film or photographic evidence to support its claims. It's not provided many pictures, any really helpful pictures of debris that it can securely confirm as being from Kinjal missiles. Notably, it has not enabled inspections, even by friendly journalists, of the Patriot missile system that it says came out of this attack unscathed. After all, the Russians know where it is, so why not make it accessible? It's done none of these things. In fact, it's not shown the Patriot missile system at all. So all of this, to my mind, ought to argue for being very skeptical about these claims that the Ukrainians are making. And yet we see the West continues to endorse them, just as it continues to endorse regular Ukrainian claims that they shoot down most or even all of the missiles that the Russians launch across Ukraine, even though those claims are demonstrably untrue. We've just had another example of a case where Ukraine has been saying things that are demonstrably untrue. I discussed how 2 days ago a Russian intelligence ship, the Ivan Hurs, was attacked by Ukrainian water drones, seaborne drones, near the Bosphorus, whilst it was monitoring the TurkStream pipeline. Now, the first thing to say is that this is an important and concerning attack in itself. It took place near Turkish territory. The Ivan Hurs, incidentally, is not, properly speaking, a warship at all. It is a ship that it's a spy ship. It engages in intelligence gathering, and what it seemed to be doing was ensuring that there was no sabotage of the TurkStream pipeline, similar to the sabotage that there has been of the Nord Stream pipelines. It doesn't have heavy weapons. Its only weapons are 4 banks of 14.5mm heavy machine guns and man-portable air defense missile systems. So it is not a warship, strictly speaking. So the attack on this ship clearly appears to have been intended to prevent this particular ship from continuing to undertake surveillance and protection of the TurkStream pipeline. That suggests, by the way, that someone in Ukraine, perhaps in association with Western governments, is now considering a possible sabotage attempt of the TurkStream pipeline, similar to the ones that have been carried out of the Nord Stream pipelines. And I've already said that President Erdogan of Turkey, who will probably be re-elected shortly, must be extremely concerned and very angry about this event, and you can understand why. But anyway, the important point about this story is this. The point I'm making about this story, the further point I'm making about this story is this, is that the Russians said that in the event, the Ivan Hurs, the crew of the Ivan Hurs, spotted all these drones heading towards the ship, and they were able to blow them all up. They were able to use their 14.5mm machine guns to destroy all of these drones before they reached the ship. Well, Ukraine has claimed otherwise. It's suggested that, in fact, one of these drones did reach the ship, that it carried out an explosion there, and it's even published what it says is a video of this drone approaching the ship, getting very close to the ship indeed, and it doesn't actually show an impact, but the implication is that something very like an impact did indeed happen. And predictably, the media in the West, many parts of the media in the West, have again reported all these claims from Ukraine as if they were true. So I've read reports about how the Ivan Hurs was damaged, how it was experienced damage as a result of this attack, how one drone at least seems to have got through. Except we know it didn't happen. And we know it didn't happen because the Ivan Hurs has now returned to Sevastopol after its patrol. And there are pictures of it, and I have no doubt about the fact that these are reliable pictures, and they show that the ship is completely undamaged. So when CNN says that video shows Russian reconnaissance ship seemingly hit by unmanned drone, by unmanned surface vessel, that report was wrong. So if Ukraine is not providing accurate reports about an attack on a ship like the ETHEREUM, if it's not providing accurate reports about Russian missile strikes, why believe the improbable story that Ukraine shot down 6 Kinjal missiles, especially when just short time before, Ukraine's own air defense officials had been heatedly denying that Ukraine had shot down a single Kinjal missile at a time when the Ukrainian politicians were claiming that it had done. Now, I can understand why the Ukrainians might be spreading these stories. From their point of view, it makes complete sense. They do not want to give the West the impression that all this expensive equipment, like the Patriot system, which is a very expensive system, is being supplied to Ukraine only to be destroyed almost as soon as it gets there. They also want to sustain morale within Ukraine itself. They want to persuade the Ukrainian people that even whilst these attacks are going on, Ukraine is able to hit back, it's able to shoot down most of the missiles that are launched against Ukraine, or even all of them, and that they're able to hit the Russian Navy in places in the Black Sea, and they can release video of this attack on the ETHEREUM. But the problem is that if the West simply accepts these stories, these fables that Ukraine is spinning, and treats them as fact, then you can start to see how that might corrupt decision making. Because if people in the West really do believe that the Patriot missile system is able to shoot down 6 Kinjal missiles at one go, and if they start in the West basing military decisions, not just in this war in Ukraine, but generally on that kind of information which is almost certainly, in fact I would say definitely, false, then you can see that all sorts of problems are likely to follow, and follow before very long. Well, one example of this may be this decision to supply F-16s to Ukraine. Now, there's been a whole series of statements by US military officials, General Milley being one. He's just made a further commentary about this. I get the strong sense that he was never a supporter of supplying Ukraine with F-16s, but he said that it's not a game changer. He said that it's going to be an expensive thing to supply to Ukraine. It's going to be a very expensive thing to operate. We're talking about, he said, that supplying just 10 F-16s would cost $1 billion, and a further $1 billion to maintain them, $2 billion. So, supplying F-16s is going to cause the cost to explode. And he's made the point that Russia has huge numbers now of 4th and increasingly 5th generation fighters that it can deploy to the battlefronts, and that no one should expect the F-16 to achieve very much. But, of course, if you believe, as I suspect some Western policymakers do, that the Russian military situation is different, that the Russian Air Force is not making any kind of impact in the war, even though that is clearly wrong and increasingly wrong, that the Russian missiles are not what they're cracked up to be. Of course, the Kinjal is a missile that you launch, not a missile that shoots down aircraft. But if you believe that the Patriot is far superior to Russian systems, your tanks are far superior to Russian systems, Russian tanks, your aircraft are far superior to Russian aircraft, then I can see why it might be tempting to think that by supplying F-16s, well, that will somehow change the course of the battle. And of course, if you start making other decisions, if you start, for example, drifting into a confrontation with China in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Straits, because following a false report from Kiev, you've persuaded yourself that hypersonic missiles are not as dangerous as some people have been saying, well, it seems to me then you're in very serious trouble and you're likely to get other people into trouble too. Anyway, I just wanted to say all of this. I wanted to discuss this because I have been somewhat concerned by these articles that have been appearing. In fairness, there have been others which look more skeptical about these Ukrainian claims. But overall, I'm just concerned that far too many people are buying into them, even though we have had repeated examples of Ukraine making claims which turn out to be untrue, and the Ivan Hus episode is simply another example. Well, so much for the war. There's been an extraordinary sequence of meetings in Moscow, all connected with the meeting of the Eurasian Economic Union. Now, I touched on this in my previous program, but of course the big story that's come out, and which has attracted public and international attention, are the peace moves now between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, a couple of days ago, the Armenian Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan, said that Armenia recognized the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan and appeared to accept that Nagorno-Karabakh would remain part of Azerbaijan. And there's now talk that a peace treaty between Azerbaijan and Armenia is pending, and that it could be signed as soon as the 1st of June. And there's a lot of discussion and speculation about Pashinyan's motives and intentions here. It's been suggested, and it's not entirely implausible given his background, that the reason he's pursuing peace with Azerbaijan is because he's seeking to pull Armenia away from Russia, realign it with the West, and that eventually, once the peace treaty is concluded, he will pull out of the Eurasian Economic Union and the Collective Security Treaty Organization and seek membership of the European Union. Now, this is possible, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert in understanding Pashinyan's policies or Armenian policy, but Pashinyan was a prominent participant in these meetings in Moscow. He had a one-to-one meeting with Putin. Putin, by the way, also had a one-to-one meeting with Aliyev, who is the president of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan, incidentally, is not a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, but nonetheless, Aliyev came to Moscow, and I'll discuss the importance of this in a moment. Anyway, Putin had one-to-one meetings with both of these leaders, and then he had a joint meeting with both of them together at the same time. And I have to say that my very strong impression is that it is the Russians, in fact, who are driving this, that Pashinyan is basically going along with what Putin and the Kremlin has always wanted. And the outlines of the deal are fairly clear now. Armenia recognizes Nagorno-Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijani sovereignty is restored. Azerbaijan in return grants Nagorno-Karabakh considerable autonomy. Each country then recognizes and gives security guarantees for the borders of the other, and all of the various roads and railway lines and links which have basically been severed in this region since the crisis in the Southern Caucasus began in the late 1990s, that they're all reopened, allowing proper trade flows to resume. Now, I have to say that to me, this has something of the Minsk agreement about it. It's the same kind of deal that Putin seems to have envisaged negotiating in order to try and end the crisis in Ukraine back in 2015. The idea then was that Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty over Donbass would be preserved, but that Donbass would be granted very extensive autonomy within Ukraine. And it looks to me very similar. This is very similar to what I suspect Putin is trying to engineer in this conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, I suspect there'll be a lot of people in Armenia who are very unhappy, and I suspect there will be a lot of people in Armenia who wonder whether Azerbaijan can be trusted to abide by whatever autonomy it promises to Nagorno-Karabakh. I would not be surprised, personally, if there were a peace treaty, that the Russians step in as guarantors, that they guarantee the provisions of this treaty. In other words, they would give people in Nagorno-Karabakh some kind of guarantee of Russian protection in case Azerbaijan goes back on what it has agreed to. That's not impossible. As to what the Russian objective here is, I think it is fairly clear. It is to get Azerbaijan to join the Eurasian Economic Union. And notice that Aliyev has attended a meeting of the Eurasian Economic Union, and he seems to be edging towards doing that very thing. Apparently, the relationship between Putin and Aliyev is a good one, and I can see why, for many reasons, for Azerbaijan, that might be attractive. So, taken together with the moves by the current government of Georgia to start to try to unblock some of the problems that have existed between Georgia and Russia. The government of Georgia has basically, as far as I can understand it, agreed visa-free travel with Russia now, and has allowed direct flights between Moscow and Tbilisi, the Georgian capital, which, by the way, cuts completely across the European Union's prohibition on direct flights by Russian airlines to EU capitals. But anyway, taken together, all of these moves do seem to point to a pacification of the situation in the Southern Caucasus, and perhaps ultimately a pull of the countries of the Southern Caucasus into this Eurasian system. And of course, the Eurasian Economic Union isn't just Russia and Armenia and potentially Azerbaijan. Belarus is, of course, also another member country. Kazakhstan, which some people had speculated was drifting away from Moscow, is also a member, and the Kazakh President Tokayev, was present in Moscow. He said that pursuing economic integration through the Eurasian Economic Union is Kazakhstan's priority. He spoke about making Kazakhstan a major industrial hub of this union in Central Asia, which is an interesting thought. But interestingly, also, this meeting of the heads of the Eurasian Economic Union took place in two formats. So there was a private format, a closed format, which was included only those countries that are actual members of the Eurasian Economic Union, and then it came with an extended format meeting, which was attended by people like the President of Azerbaijan, as I've already said, but also by other Central Asian leaders, like, for example, the President of Uzbekistan, who I understand participated virtually. And Putin has made some very remarkable comments over the course of this meeting. He's spoken about how the Eurasian Economic Union is evolving into another pole of the emerging multipolarity. And he also seemed to speak of very extensive integration of the Eurasian Economic Union indeed. He spoke about free travel, free movement of labour, free movement of goods and services across the Eurasian Economic Union. None of the other leaders, seem to contradict him. That isn't just, of course, a major step towards economic integration, or perhaps I should say reintegration, because all of these countries, of course, were once members of a single economic union, which was the Soviet Union. But also, it would negate Western sanctions. It would mean that Western sanctions were no longer enforceable in any of these countries, because, as I said, goods, labour, money, all of that would circulate freely between them. Now, some of this may seem a little bit like the European Union beginning to emerge in Central Asia, in Eurasia. I don't think there are any real similarities or resemblances, but it clearly is some sort of attempt to put together the pieces, the economic pieces of the Soviet Union, the broken pieces of the Soviet Union, and to slot them together again. And it's important to stress that the two big outside powers involved in Central Asia, India and China, seem to be supporting this process. Xi Jinping had this meeting with the Central Asian leaders in Xi'an just last week. The purpose of that meeting, or so it seems to me, very clearly now, was to make it clear to the Central Asian leaders that China supports this process of Central Asian, Eurasian integration, which is taking place, and which we're seeing an institutional expression in Moscow. Now, all of this is very much a work in progress. I'm not sure precisely where it's going. I can foresee any number of problems along the way. And of course, we'll see whether this peace treaty between Azerbaijan and Armenia actually happens, and if it happens, whether it sticks, and if it does stick, what Armenia will do. But it does all provide food for thought. Now, going back to US policies, US policy, ever since the end of the Cold War, has officially been to prevent a new superpower rival emerging in Eurasia. Actually, this is a doctrine, this is actually a formal foreign policy doctrine that the United States has. And the war in Ukraine is, at least in part, a reflection of this. The US and the European Union, the Western powers, were very, very concerned to prevent Ukraine from joining the Eurasian Economic Union, something which I remember Putin suggesting when President Yanukovych was elected president of Ukraine 4 years before the Maidan events in 2010. And part of the reason why there's been all this talk about Ukraine entering the EU and entering NATO is to prevent Ukraine becoming a part of this process of Eurasian integration, and indeed to try to upset and prevent this process of Eurasian integration happening at all. When people talk about Eurasian integration in the West, they always talk about a Russian plan to recreate the Soviet Union. In fact, when the conflict in Ukraine started in earnest in February last year, I can remember Biden himself saying that Putin's intention is to recreate the Soviet Union. Well, I don't see this at all. I don't think this is what this plan is about. I think, as I said, what we're looking at is a economic union that is now emerging, though no doubt in time it will have a political and perhaps military dimension, but it will not be at all like the Soviet Union, and it will be anchored in the larger alliance system that's emerging in this part of the world, which involves Iran, where, as I said, Elvira Nabiullina, the chair of the Russian Central Bank, has just been on a visit, and China, which Prime Minister Mishustin of Russia has also just visited, and of course Turkey, assuming that Erdogan is re-elected, in which case I expect a Putin-Erdogan summit to take place pretty soon. So we're talking about something very different, both from the EU and from the Soviet Union. But that doesn't mean that what isn't taking place isn't important, in fact, potentially world-changing. We start to see Eurasian integration take place in earnest in this kind of way, encompassing the Caucasus as well, then, assuming it reaches its end point, that would be, frankly, in global terms, something of a game changer. Now, the point is that if Western policy towards Ukraine was intended to stop this, then it clearly hasn't. Clearly, the situation in Ukraine itself remains unresolved. But all of the other pieces are now coming together, and that seems to be the big takeaway from these two meetings that have now happened. The one chaired by Xi Jinping in Xi'an, and this latest meeting that's happening now in Moscow. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon. Thank you for joining me again today. Just to remind you again, you can find all of our programs on our various channels: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop where you can find all sorts of amazing things, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.